My name is Sarah Martinez, and I never thought I'd be standing in front of the marble steps of the Whitmore estate in Beverly Hills, California, on a gray October morning in 2024. The autumn air carried the scent of eucalyptus and the distant hum of traffic from Sunset Boulevard, but all I could focus on was the imposing mansion before me, a place I'd only seen in old photographs my mother kept hidden in a shoebox. I adjusted my worn denim jacket and checked my phone one more time. The text from the law firm was still there. Estate reading for Harold Whitmore, deceased. Your presence is required. 10 a.m. sharp. My hands trembled slightly as I read it again. Harold Whitmore, my biological father, a man I'd never met, never spoken to, and who had never acknowledged my existence in my 28 years of life. Growing up in a small apartment in East Los Angeles with my mother, Maria, I'd learned early that some doors remained forever closed. She worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, and whenever I asked about my father, her eyes would grow distant. Some people live in different worlds, mija, she'd say, her accent thick with emotion. We make our own family, but here I was, walking up the pristine stone pathway, my second-hand boots clicking against the manicured grounds. The estate was everything I'd imagined: towering palm trees, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a fountain that probably cost more than my annual salary as a high school teacher. I felt like an intruder in my own story. The massive oak doors opened before I could knock. A distinguished older gentleman in a perfectly pressed suit greeted me with a warm smile that seemed genuine, despite the circumstances. Ms. Martinez, I presume? I'm Charles Pemberton, Mr. Whitmore's attorney. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I followed him through hallways lined with oil paintings and antique furniture that screamed old money. The house smelled like leather and vanilla, nothing like the apartment I'd grown up in, where the scent of my mother's cooking always lingered in the air. I have to admit, Mr. Pemberton, I'm not sure why I'm here. I never had any relationship with Harold. Charles paused at a set of double doors. Please call me Charles. And you're here because Harold wanted you to be. That's all that matters today. He pushed open the doors to reveal a wood-paneled library that looked like something out of a movie. But what stopped me in my tracks wasn't the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves or the ornate fireplace. It was the small crowd of people already seated around a massive conference table, all of whom turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. A woman in her 50s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a Chanel suit looked me up and down with undisguised disdain. Next to her sat a man about my age wearing a tailored navy suit and a scowl that could have frozen the California sun. There were others too, people who looked like they belonged in this world of marble and mahogany. Everyone, this is Sarah Martinez, Charles announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Harold's daughter. The blonde woman, who I would later learn was Victoria Whitmore, Harold's second wife, let out a sharp laugh. His daughter? Charles, surely you're mistaken. Harold never mentioned having another child. The young man in the navy suit leaned forward. This is ridiculous. I'm his only son, his only heir. Who is this woman, and what is she doing here? My cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. I started to turn toward the door, ready to leave this humiliating situation, when Charles placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Please, Sarah, take a seat. Everything will become clear shortly. I found myself in a leather chair that probably cost more than my car, surrounded by people who clearly saw me as nothing more than an unwelcome intrusion. The whispers started immediately. Look at her clothes, I heard someone murmur. She's obviously here for money. Probably some scam artist, another voice added. Harold was getting old. Maybe she manipulated him somehow. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, fighting back tears. This was exactly why my mother had never pursued anything from Harold. She'd known this would happen, that I'd be seen as less than, as someone who didn't belong. Charles cleared his throat, commanding attention. Before we begin with the formal reading of the will, Harold left specific instructions. He wanted me to share something with all of you, particularly with Sarah. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope with my name written in elegant cursive across the front. My heart hammered against my ribs as he placed it in my hands. Harold wrote this letter specifically for you, Sarah. He wanted you to read it aloud, here, in front of everyone. Victoria scoffed. This is highly irregular, Charles. We're here for the reading of the will. not for some theatrical performance. These were Harold's explicit wishes, Charles replied firmly. Sarah, would you please read the letter? My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The paper inside was heavy and cream-colored, the kind of stationery that spoke of quality and permanence. As I unfolded it, I could see Harold's handwriting, neat, precise, and somehow familiar, though I'd never seen it before. I looked up at the faces around me, some impatient, others curious, all of them waiting. Taking a deep breath, I began to read, My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here to say the words I should have said 28 years ago. I know you must be confused, perhaps angry, and certainly wondering why you've been brought into this room full of strangers who are questioning your very right to exist in this moment. My voice caught slightly, but I continued. First, let me say what I should have said the day you were born. I am sorry. I am sorry for the cowardice that kept me from being the father you deserved. I am sorry for the years of silence, for the birthdays I missed, for the graduations I wasn't there to witness, for the moments both big and small when you might have needed a father's love and guidance. The room had gone completely silent. Even Victoria's expression had shifted from disdain to something more complicated. I want you to know that your mother, Maria, was the most remarkable woman I ever knew. She had a strength and grace that I lacked, a courage that I envied. When she told me she was pregnant with you, I was already engaged to someone else, someone my family had chosen for me. I was weak, Sarah. I chose the easy path, the expected path, and in doing so, I abandoned the two people who mattered most. I had to pause, my eyes blurring with tears. Around the table, I could see that others were affected too. The young man in the navy suit, presumably Harold's son, had lost his earlier hostility and was listening intently. But I want you to understand something, my dear daughter. Not a day went by that I didn't think about you. I have followed your life from a distance, and I am so proud of the woman you've become. A teacher, like your mother wanted to be before life took her in a different direction. You have her compassion, her intelligence, her beautiful spirit. I looked up at Charles, who nodded encouragingly. There's more? Please continue. I know that the people in this room, my family, my friends, my business associates, are probably wondering why you're here. Some of them may have already made assumptions about who you are and what you want. They may see you as an outsider, someone who doesn't belong in their world. And perhaps they're right. Perhaps you don't belong in this world of appearances and expectations, of marriages made for convenience and love measured in stock options. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But what they don't understand, what they can't see, is that you represent something far more valuable than anything in this room. You represent authenticity, integrity, and the kind of genuine love that I was never brave enough to fight for. You are living proof that real worth isn't measured in bank accounts or real estate holdings or social connections. The letter continued, but I had to stop for a moment. The words were overwhelming, not just because of what they said, but because of what they meant. For the first time in my life, I was hearing from the man who had helped create me, and his words were nothing like what I'd expected. Sarah, Charles said gently, would you like to continue, or would you prefer to take a break? I looked around the room again. The faces that had been hostile or dismissive when I'd first arrived were now watching me with something different. Curiosity, perhaps even respect. The young man in the navy suit was leaning forward, his expression earnest. I'll continue, I said, my voice stronger now. As you finish reading this letter, know that everything I'm about to give you comes not from guilt or obligation, but from love. Love for the daughter I never got to know, love for the woman you've become despite my absence, and love for the future you're going to build. I turned the page, and what I saw there made my breath catch in my throat. To my beloved daughter Sarah, I leave not just money or property, but something far more precious. I leave you the truth about our family, about your heritage, and about the strength that runs in your blood. The people in this room have spent their lives believing that worth is inherited, that value is determined by circumstance of birth. But you, my dear, are about to show them that true worth is earned through character, through kindness, through the courage to be authentic in a world that rewards pretense. The room was so quiet I could hear the fountain outside, the distant sound of traffic, even the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. The specifics of what I'm leaving you will be detailed in the formal will reading. But I want you to understand something first. You are not here as a charity case or an afterthought. You are here as my daughter, as someone who has already proven herself worthy of everything I'm about to give you, not because of who your father was, but because of who you are. I looked up from the letter, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. "There's one more page," Charles said softly. I turned to the final page, and Harold's handwriting seemed even more personal here, less formal. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. I need you to be brave in the way I never was. I need you to take what I'm giving you and use it not to join this world of marble and mahogany, but to build something better, something real, something that would make your mother proud." My voice broke slightly as I read the final lines. "I spent my life accumulating things, but you, my dear daughter, you've spent your life accumulating something far more valuable, the respect and love of the people around you. Don't let anyone in this room or anywhere else tell you that you don't belong. You belong wherever you choose to stand, wherever you choose to build your life, wherever you choose to plant your roots." I folded the letter carefully, my hands no longer shaking. When I looked up, the room was filled with a different kind of silence, not the hostile quiet of people waiting to judge, but the thoughtful silence of people who had just heard something that changed their perspective. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice much softer than before. I had no idea Harold felt this way. He never spoke about me," I finished. "I know, and I understand why, but he did think about me, apparently, more than I ever imagined." The young man in the navy suit stood up and extended his hand. "I'm David Whitmore. I guess I'm your half-brother. I owe you an apology for how I reacted when you came in." I shook his hand, surprised by the warmth in his grip. "You don't owe me anything, David. This is as much a shock to you as it is to me." Charles cleared his throat. "If everyone is ready, we can proceed with the formal reading of the will, but I think Harold would be pleased with how this first part went." As we prepared to learn the details of Harold's bequests, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in that room. I had arrived as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who was laughed at and questioned. But Harold's letter had done something powerful. It had given me a place to stand, an identity that wasn't dependent on their acceptance or approval. I was Sarah Martinez, Harold Whitmore's daughter, and I belonged exactly where I was. The formal reading of Harold Whitmore's will was unlike anything I could have imagined. As Charles opened the official document, I found myself gripping the arms of my chair, still processing the emotional impact of the letter I'd just read aloud. "The last will and testament of Harold James Whitmore," Charles began, his voice taking on the formal tone of legal proceedings. "I, Harold James Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament." I glanced around the room. David was sitting straighter now, his earlier hostility replaced by what looked like genuine curiosity about me. Victoria maintained her composed exterior, but I could see tension in the way she held her shoulders. There were others in the room too, business associates, distant relatives, people whose names I'd learn as the reading progressed. To my wife, Victoria Whitmore, I leave the house in the Hamptons, the condo in Aspen, and a trust fund of $2 million, along with my gratitude for the years we shared together. Victoria nodded, apparently satisfied with this arrangement. It was generous, certainly, but I could sense it wasn't what she'd been expecting. To my son, David Whitmore, I leave the family business, Whitmore Construction, along with all its assets and holdings, trusting in his ability to lead it into the future with integrity and vision. David's face showed a mixture of pride and responsibility. At 26, he was inheriting a construction empire that had been built over 3 generations. I could see the weight of that legacy settling on his shoulders. Charles continued reading through various bequests, generous donations to charities, gifts to longtime employees, provisions for the household staff. Harold had been thorough, taking care of everyone who had been part of his life. Then Charles paused, looking directly at me. "And now we come to the provisions for Sarah Martinez, Harold's daughter." My heart started racing again. Whatever was coming, I could tell from Charles's expression that it was significant. "To my daughter Sarah Martinez, I leave the sum of $5 million to be held in trust and distributed according to the terms I will now outline." $5 million. The number seemed impossible, surreal. I'd never even imagined that much money, let alone thought it could be mine. Around the table, I could see expressions of surprise, and in some cases, resentment. However, Charles continued, this inheritance comes with specific conditions that reflect Harold's wishes for how these funds should be used. Here it comes, I thought. The catch, the strings attached. Sarah, your father wanted to ensure that this money would be used in a way that honors both your mother's memory and your own values. The funds are to be used for one of the following purposes: establishing a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, starting a nonprofit organization focused on education or healthcare, or founding a school in an underserved community. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Even in death, Harold had understood something essential about who I was. He'd known that simply giving me money wouldn't be enough, that I'd need a purpose, a way to use his gift that aligned with my own values. Additionally, Charles continued, Sarah is to inherit the family's original property, the land in Riverside County where Harold's grandfather first settled when he came to California. It's currently undeveloped, about 50 acres, but it has significant sentimental value to the family. David leaned forward. Wait, the Riverside property? I thought that was going to be part of the business assets. No, Charles replied. Harold was very specific about this. He wanted Sarah to have the land that represents the family's origins, their roots. I was overwhelmed. $5 million, 50 acres of land, and the responsibility to use it all in a way that would honor my mother's memory and my own values. It was far more than I'd ever dreamed of, but it was also terrifying. There's one more provision, Charles said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Harold has requested that Sarah be invited to join the Whitmore Foundation Board of Directors, if she's willing. The foundation focuses on education and healthcare initiatives, areas where Harold felt Sarah's experience and perspective would be valuable. Victoria spoke up, her voice carefully controlled. Charles, I have to ask, was he in his right mind when he made these changes to the will? This is highly unusual. Victoria, I can assure you that Harold was completely lucid and deliberate in all of these decisions. In fact, he updated his will just 3 months ago, after extensive discussions with me about his intentions. I found my voice for the first time since the reading began. I need to ask something. When did Harold first learn about me? When did he know I existed? Charles looked at me with compassion. Sarah, he knew about you from the beginning. He received updates about your life regularly. Your graduations, your teaching achievements, your mother's health challenges. He even attended your high school graduation, though he stayed in the back where you wouldn't see him. The room seemed to spin slightly. He was there? At my graduation? He was there for many of your important moments, Sarah. He just never felt he had the right to approach you directly. He was afraid that inserting himself into your life would cause more harm than good. I thought back to that day 6 years ago, standing on the stage in my cap and gown, looking out at the sparse crowd. My mother had been there, beaming with pride, despite being exhausted from her double shift. A few of my friends' families had come, but I'd never imagined that somewhere in that auditorium, my father had been watching too. Why now? I asked. Why leave me all of this now? Charles set down the will and looked at me directly. Because Harold realized that he'd made a mistake. He'd spent his whole life thinking that love meant staying away, that the kindest thing he could do was not disrupt your life. But in his final months, he came to understand that love sometimes means taking risks, means being vulnerable, means reaching out even when you're not sure of the reception you'll get. David spoke up, his voice thoughtful. Sarah, I want you to know that I had no idea about any of this, about you, about Father's feelings, about his regrets. But after hearing that letter, after seeing what he's left you and why, I think I understand him better now than I ever did when he was alive. I looked at David, this half-brother I'd never known I had. What was he like? As a father? David considered the question carefully. He was complicated. He provided for me, made sure I had every opportunity, but he wasn't emotionally available. He was always working, always focused on the business. I spent my childhood trying to earn his approval, trying to prove I was worthy of being his son. He paused. I think maybe he didn't know how to be a father because he'd never allowed himself to learn. Victoria had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. Harold carried a lot of guilt about you, Sarah. In recent years, especially after your mother's death. He would sometimes talk about the choices he'd made. He wondered if you'd grown up hating him, if you'd ever want to know him. My mother had died 2 years ago, after a long battle with cancer. I'd been with her at the end, holding her hand in the same hospital where she'd worked for 25 years. In those final days, she'd talked about forgiveness, about letting go of old hurts. I thought she was just talking about general life philosophy, but now I wondered if she'd been thinking about Harold. I never hated him, I said quietly. I was angry sometimes, especially when I was younger. I wondered what I'd done wrong, why he didn't want to know me. But my mother, she taught me that some situations are more complicated than they appear. She said that sometimes people make choices that seem wrong from the outside, but make sense given their circumstances at the time. Charles nodded. Your mother was a wise woman. Harold spoke about her often, always with deep respect and regret. He never forgave himself for not being brave enough to choose love over expectation. The weight of everything, the money, the land, the responsibility, the knowledge that Harold had been watching over me from a distance was beginning to settle in. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a completely different life than the one I'd been living. I need some time to process all of this, I said. It's overwhelming. Of course, Charles replied. Take all the time you need. The trust fund will be established according to Harold's wishes, but there's no rush on deciding exactly how you want to use it. The important thing is that you use it in a way that feels right to you. As the formal reading concluded and people began to file out of the room, David approached me. Sarah, I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I have a sister. He paused. Would you maybe want to have dinner sometime? I'd like to get to know you, to hear about your life, your mother, what it was like growing up. I looked at this young man who shared my father's eyes and my own stubborn chin. I'd like that, David. I'd like that very much. As I prepared to leave the Whitmore estate, I realized that I was not the same person who had walked up those marble steps that morning. I was still Sarah Martinez, still a high school teacher from East LA, still my mother's daughter, but now I was also Harold Whitmore's daughter, and that came with both privileges and responsibilities I was only beginning to understand. The question now was, what was I going to do with this incredible, terrifying, life-changing gift? 3 weeks after the will reading, I found myself standing in the middle of 50 acres of undeveloped land in Riverside County, California. The October sun was warm on my face, and the Santa Ana winds carried the scent of sage and possibility across the rolling hills. David stood beside me, both of us trying to envision what this empty land could become. Father used to bring me here when I was a kid, David said, kicking at a clump of desert grass. He'd tell me stories about our great-grandfather, how he came here from Ireland with nothing but a few dollars and a dream of building something lasting. I pulled out the survey maps Charles had given me, trying to match the property lines to the landscape around us. It's beautiful, I said, and I meant it. The land had a wild, untamed quality that spoke to something deep in my soul. But I have to admit, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with it. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings with financial advisors, lawyers, and nonprofit consultants. Everyone had opinions about how I should use Harold's gift, but none of their suggestions felt quite right. A scholarship fund was noble but impersonal. A nonprofit organization felt too bureaucratic. The idea of founding a school was appealing but seemed overwhelming. You know, David said, interrupting my thoughts, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner last week, about your students and the challenges they face. We'd had several dinners together since the will reading, gradually building a relationship that felt natural despite our different backgrounds. David had grown up with every advantage, but he wasn't spoiled or entitled. He was genuinely interested in understanding the world I came from, the students I taught, the community that had shaped me. What about them? I asked. You mentioned that some of your brightest students don't go to college not because they can't academically, but because they can't afford it, or because their families need them to work, or because they don't see college as relevant to their lives. I nodded. It was one of the most heartbreaking parts of my job, watching incredibly talented young people limit their futures because of circumstances beyond their control. What if, David continued, instead of just giving them scholarships to existing colleges, you created something different, something that addressed the specific barriers they face? I looked at him curiously. What do you mean? I mean, what if you built a school right here on this land, but not a traditional school? Something that combined college-level education with practical skills, that provided housing and support for students who needed it, that connected learning to real-world problem-solving in their communities? The idea hit me like a physical force. I could suddenly see it. Buildings that respected the natural landscape, students working on projects that mattered, a place where learning wasn't separated from living. David, that's incredible. But I don't know anything about building a school. I don't know about construction or administration but I do, he said quietly. I know about construction. I know about project management. I know about turning ideas into reality. He paused. What if we did this together? What if we built something that honored both sides of our father's legacy? Your commitment to education and my family's expertise in construction. I stared at him, then at the land around us. Are you serious? I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Sarah, I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about that letter Father wrote to you, about what he said about building something real. I've been running his construction company for 2 years, and while it's successful, it's not meaningful. It's just buildings and profit margins. He turned to face me fully. But this could be something that actually changes lives. This could be the kind of legacy that matters. Over the following weeks, David and I threw ourselves into researching innovative educational models. We visited programs like Deep Springs College in California, which combined rigorous academics with practical work on a working ranch. We studied the success of trade schools that were addressing the skills gap in American manufacturing. We interviewed educators who were pioneering new approaches to higher education. Most importantly, I talked to my students. I asked them what they would want from a college experience, what would make higher education feel relevant and accessible to them. Their answers were remarkably consistent. They wanted education that connected to real jobs, that didn't saddle them with crushing debt, that respected their family obligations, and that treated them as whole people rather than just academic performers. Mrs. Martinez, said Maria Santos, one of my brightest seniors. I'd love to study engineering, but I can't leave my family. My mom needs help with my younger brothers, and we can't afford for me to not work. If there was a school that let me learn while still being part of my community, while still contributing to my family, that would be everything. I started keeping a notebook of these conversations, documenting not just what my students wanted, but what they needed. The picture that emerged was of young people who were incredibly motivated, but faced systemic barriers that traditional higher education wasn't designed to address. Meanwhile, David was working on the practical aspects of our vision. He'd identified architects who specialized in sustainable, community-focused design. He'd researched zoning requirements and environmental impact assessments. He'd even begun preliminary conversations with educators who might be interested in joining our faculty. Sarah, he said one evening as we sat in his office, surrounded by sketches and research papers, I think we need to be more specific about what we're creating. We can't just say a different kind of school. We need to define exactly what that means. I looked at the wall where we'd posted index cards with ideas, quotes from students, and photographs of the land. What if we called it a community college of real solutions, a place where students spend 2 years learning both academic subjects and practical skills, working on actual projects that benefit local communities? David nodded, adding to the idea. And what if students didn't pay tuition in the traditional sense? What if they earned their education through the work they do on community projects? They'd graduate debt-free, with real experience, and with connections to local employers and organizations. The more we talked, the more excited I became. This wasn't just about using Harold's money. It was about creating something that could genuinely transform lives, something that addressed real problems with innovative solutions. But not everyone was supportive of our vision. Sarah, dear, Victoria said during one of our increasingly frequent family dinners, I understand that you want to honor Harold's memory, but are you sure this is the best use of his gift? $5 million could fund a lot of scholarships to established universities. Or, added Robert Chen, one of Harold's former business partners, you could invest it conservatively and use the interest to fund ongoing charitable work. Building a school from scratch is risky, expensive, and frankly, unproven. I understood their concerns, but I also realized that they were missing something fundamental. Harold didn't leave me this money to take the safe path, I said. He left it to me because he believed I would use it to build something real, something that reflected my values and my mother's legacy. David supported me completely. "Sarah's right," he said. "This isn't about playing it safe. This is about taking the resources we've been given and using them to create something that doesn't exist yet, something that could serve as a model for other communities." The turning point came when we received an unexpected visitor at the Riverside property. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a retired professor of education from UC Berkeley, had heard about our project through a mutual contact and wanted to see what we were planning. "I've spent 40 years in traditional higher education," she said as we walked the property together. "I've seen brilliant students fail because the system wasn't designed for them, and I've seen mediocre students succeed because they had advantages others didn't. What you're proposing, it could be revolutionary." She agreed to serve as our educational consultant, helping us design a curriculum that would be both academically rigorous and practically relevant. Her endorsement gave us credibility with other educators, and word began to spread about our project. As winter approached, we had a preliminary design for the campus, a detailed educational plan, and a growing network of supporters. But more importantly, we had something else, a shared vision of what education could be when it was rooted in community, connected to real work, and designed around the needs of students rather than the convenience of institutions. Standing on the property as the sun set over the hills, I thought about Harold's letter, about his challenge to build something better than the world he'd known. I thought about my mother, who had always believed that education was the key to a better life, but had never had the opportunity to pursue it herself. "Are you ready for this?" David asked, joining me as I watched the last light fade from the sky. I thought about my students, about young people like Maria Santos, who had so much potential but faced so many barriers. I thought about the conversations we'd had, the dreams they'd shared, the future they deserved. "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time since this journey began, I felt completely certain about the path ahead. 1 year later, I stood in the same spot where David and I had first envisioned our school, but now the landscape had been transformed. The Community College of Real Solutions was no longer just an idea. It was a reality, taking shape in wood, steel, and glass. The construction was almost complete. The main academic building, designed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape, featured solar panels and rainwater collection systems that would make it nearly self-sufficient. The student housing, designed as small apartments rather than traditional dorms, would allow students to live with dignity while pursuing their education. The workshop spaces, where students would learn everything from sustainable agriculture to renewable energy technology, were equipped with the latest tools and technology. But the most beautiful part wasn't the buildings. It was watching our first class of students arrive. Maria Santos was among them, the young woman who had told me she couldn't leave her family to pursue her education. She'd been accepted into our engineering and community development program, where she would spend 2 years learning engineering principles while working on real projects in her own community. Her family had been skeptical at first, but when they learned that she could live on campus during the week and return home on weekends, that she would graduate debt-free, and that her education would directly benefit their neighborhood, they became our biggest supporters. "Ms. Martinez," Maria said, approaching me as I watched the students settle into their new homes. "I still can't believe this is real. I'm actually going to be an engineer." I smiled, remembering the uncertain young woman who had sat in my high school classroom just 2 years earlier. "You were always going to be an engineer, Maria. We just created a path that worked for your life." The opening ceremony was held on a warm October afternoon, exactly 2 years after I'd first walked up the steps of the Whitmore estate. The contrast between that day and this one was striking. Instead of feeling like an outsider, I was surrounded by community, by students and faculty, and local residents who had become invested in our vision. David gave the opening address, speaking about the importance of education that connects to real work, real problems, and real communities. Dr. Rodriguez introduced our faculty, an impressive group of educators who had left traditional academic positions to be part of something innovative. Local business leaders spoke about the partnerships we'd formed, the internships and job opportunities that awaited our graduates. But the most meaningful moment came when I was invited to speak about the school's founding and mission. 2 years ago, I began, looking out at the crowd of students, families, and community members. I learned that I had a father I'd never known, who had been watching my life from a distance, who had left me resources that seemed impossible to use worthily. I was terrified of that responsibility, terrified of disappointing him, terrified of not living up to the trust he'd placed in me. I paused, finding Maria's face in the crowd, along with the other students who had inspired this journey. But I learned something important. The best way to honor a gift is not to preserve it unchanged, but to use it to create something new, something that serves others, something that makes the world a little bit better than it was before. I gestured toward the buildings around us. This school exists because of Harold Whitmore's generosity, but it was shaped by the voices of students who knew what they needed, by educators who were willing to think differently, and by a community that believed in second chances and new possibilities. The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most was seeing the faces of our students, young people who had been told in 1,000 small ways that higher education wasn't for them, that they should accept limitations rather than pursue dreams. After the ceremony, as the sun began to set over the hills, I found myself walking through the campus with an unexpected visitor. Charles Pemberton, now in his 70s but still sharp and engaged, had driven down from Beverly Hills to see what we'd built. "Harold would be proud," he said simply, pausing to watch a group of students working on a sustainable farming project. "But more than that, I think he'd be amazed. This is so much more than even he imagined when he wrote that letter." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, past the workshop where students were learning to build solar panels, past the computer lab where others were developing apps to address local community challenges, past the common areas where informal study groups had already formed. "Charles," I said finally, "can I ask you something that's been on my mind?" "Of course. Do you think Harold really believed I could do this? Or was he just hoping I'd try?" Charles stopped walking and turned to face me. "Sarah, in all my years of practicing law, I've never seen anyone plan a bequest with as much care and thought as Harold put into yours. He didn't just leave you money. He left you a challenge, a puzzle to solve, a way to discover your own strength." He pointed toward the main building, where students were visible through the windows, studying and collaborating. He knew that simply giving you money wouldn't change your life in any meaningful way. You were already living a life of purpose and meaning. But he also knew that if he gave you the resources and the right kind of challenge, you might be able to change other lives in ways that would echo for generations. As we continued our walk, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 2 years ago, I'd been a high school teacher living paycheck to paycheck, passionate about education, but limited in my ability to create real change. Now I was the co-founder and president of an institution that was already attracting national attention for its innovative approach to higher education. But more than the recognition, more than the success, what mattered was the students. In just the few weeks since classes had started, I could see the transformation beginning. Students who had been told they weren't college material were thriving in an environment that valued their experiences and addressed their needs. Students who had been forced to choose between education and family were finding ways to honor both commitments. "Ms. Martinez," called out James Wilson, a student in our renewable energy technology program, "can you come look at this project we're working on?" James was a 24-year-old who had been working construction since graduating high school, supporting his mother and younger sister. He'd always been interested in solar energy, but had never had the opportunity to study it formally. Now, he was part of a team designing a solar installation for a local community center. "We've calculated that this system could reduce their energy costs by 70%, he said, showing me the plans spread across a work table. "But more than that, we're training community members to maintain the system themselves, so they'll have new skills and potential job opportunities." This was exactly what we'd envisioned, education that created immediate value for local communities while providing students with practical experience and marketable skills. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, a professor who had left a prestigious position at Stanford to join our faculty. "What convinced you to come here?" I asked her. Honestly, I was tired of teaching students who were academically prepared but had no idea how to connect their learning to real-world problems. Here, the problems come first, and the academic content follows naturally. "It's the way education should work." She gestured toward a group of students working on a water conservation project for a local agricultural community. "These students are learning chemistry, biology, engineering, and economics, but they're learning it all in service of solving an actual problem that affects real people. The motivation is completely different. Later that evening, David and I sat on the porch of the small house we'd built for me on the property. It was simple but comfortable, with a view of the valley and the lights of the communities our students would be serving. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just taken the money and used it for traditional scholarships? David asked. I considered the question. Sometimes, we could have helped more students, at least in terms of numbers. But I don't think we would have created the same kind of change. What do you mean? Traditional scholarships help individual students access existing systems. What we've built here is trying to change the system itself. If we succeed, if we can demonstrate that this model works, other communities might replicate it. The impact could be exponential. David nodded. Father always said that the best construction projects weren't just about building something functional. They were about building something that inspired other builders to think differently about what was possible. As we talked, I reflected on how much had changed, not just in my circumstances, but in my relationships. David had become not just a business partner, but a true brother, someone I trusted completely and enjoyed spending time with. Victoria, initially skeptical of our project, had become one of our most effective advocates, using her social connections to raise additional funding and awareness. Even more surprising had been the response from my former colleagues and students. Many of my former students had applied to our program, eager to continue their education in an environment that respected their backgrounds and goals. Several of my fellow teachers had asked about joining our faculty, drawn by the opportunity to teach in a more innovative and student-centered environment. You know, I said to David, I think Harold knew something I didn't understand at the time. What's that? I thought his gift was about the money, about having the resources to do something meaningful. But really, it was about the challenge. It was about forcing me to think bigger than I'd ever thought before, to believe that I could create something that didn't exist yet. The next morning, I woke early and walked through the campus as the sun was rising. Students were already up and working. Some in the gardens, others in the workshops, still others in the computer lab. The energy was infectious, the sense of purpose palpable. I stopped by the library, where we displayed copies of Harold's letter to me, along with the stories of our founding and the mission that drove our work. A plaque by the entrance read, "In memory of Harold Whitmore, who believed that true worth is earned through character, through kindness, through the courage to be authentic in a world that rewards pretense." But next to it was another plaque, one that David had suggested and I'd enthusiastically approved. In honor of Maria Martinez, who showed her daughter that some people make their own family and that love and strength can flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. As I stood there, reading those words, I realized that this school was more than just a memorial to Harold or a fulfillment of his challenge. It was a bridge between the world I'd come from and the world I was helping to create. It honored both my parents, the one who had raised me and the one who had, in his own complicated way, made this all possible. Students began arriving for their morning classes, and I watched them with the same mixture of pride and hope that I'd felt as a high school teacher, but amplified now by the knowledge that we'd created something unprecedented, something that could serve as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Maria Santos approached me as I was heading to my office. Ms. Martinez, I wanted to thank you again for making this possible, but I also wanted to ask you something. What's that, Maria? I've been thinking about what I want to do after I graduate, and I've decided I want to start a school like this in my own community. Would you help me figure out how to do that? I smiled, remembering Harold's words about building something that would echo for generations. Maria, I can't think of anything I'd rather do. As I walked toward my office, preparing for another day of classes, meetings, and the 1,000 small tasks that went into running an educational institution, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 2 years ago, I'd been an outsider, walking into a room full of strangers who questioned my right to be there. Now, I was part of a community that was creating new possibilities for students who had been similarly excluded from traditional opportunities. The laughter that had greeted my arrival at the Whitmore estate had been replaced by something far more meaningful: the sound of young people discovering their own potential, the conversations of faculty members passionate about innovative teaching, the energy of a community working together to build something better than what had existed before. Harold had been right about one thing. True worth wasn't inherited or determined by circumstances of birth. It was earned through character, through kindness, through the courage to be authentic and to take risks in service of others. But what he hadn't known, what I'd learned through building this school, was that worth was also multiplied when it was shared, when it was used to create opportunities for others to discover their own strength and potential. Standing in the doorway of my office, looking out at the campus we'd built and the students we served, I knew that this was just the beginning. The Community College of Real Solutions was already successful beyond our wildest dreams, but more importantly, it was inspiring others to think differently about education, about community, about what was possible when people worked together toward a common goal. I thought about Harold's letter, about his challenge to build something real, something that would make my mother proud. As I watched Maria Santos leading a group of younger students in a discussion about sustainable engineering, I knew that we'd succeeded beyond even Harold's ambitious vision. We'd built something that was not just real, but alive, growing, and inspiring others to build their own versions of a better world. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance of all. Not just the resources to make a difference, but the knowledge that such differences were possible, and the courage to keep building, keep growing, keep believing in the potential of every person who walked through our doors. The foundation we'd built was strong, but it was also flexible, designed to grow and adapt as our understanding of our mission deepened. And as I prepared to start another day of teaching, learning, and building, I knew that the best was yet to come. 5 years after first reading Harold's letter in that marble-lined library, I found myself standing before the California State Board of Education, presenting our school as a model for statewide educational reform. The Community College of Real Solutions had become more than just a successful experiment. It had become a blueprint for change. In the past 5 years, I explained to the board members, we've graduated over 400 students with a 95% job placement rate and 0 student debt. But more importantly, we've demonstrated that education can be both academically rigorous and practically relevant when it's designed around community needs. The numbers were impressive, but they didn't tell the full story. What mattered more were the individual transformations. Students like Maria Santos, who had indeed started her own community-based school in East LA, or James Wilson, who now ran a renewable energy company that employed dozens of local residents. After the presentation, I drove back to Riverside, taking the scenic route through the mountains. The campus had grown significantly since our opening day. We now had 3 additional buildings, including a state-of-the-art research facility where students worked on projects addressing climate change, water scarcity, and sustainable agriculture. Our student body had grown to 600, with a waiting list that stretched for months. But growth brought new challenges. As our reputation spread, we received applications from students across the country, many from privileged backgrounds who saw our school as an interesting alternative to traditional college. We'd had to develop careful admission criteria to ensure we stayed true to our mission of serving students who wouldn't otherwise have access to higher education. The hardest part, I confided to David during one of our weekly planning meetings, is maintaining our identity while scaling our impact. Success breeds its own problems. David nodded, understanding the tension. His construction company had partnered with us to build similar schools in 3 other states, each adapted to local needs and communities. But that's a good problem to have, Sarah. It means we're solving real issues that exist everywhere. The evening before the 5th anniversary celebration, I received an unexpected phone call from Victoria. Despite our initially rocky relationship, she had become one of our most effective board members, using her connections and business acumen to secure funding and partnerships. Sarah, I wanted to call before tomorrow's celebration to tell you something I've never said directly, Victoria began, her voice unusually emotional. When I first met you, I saw you as a threat, someone who might diminish what David and I had inherited from Harold. But watching what you've built, seeing the lives you've changed, I realize now that you didn't diminish Harold's legacy. You fulfilled it in ways none of us could have imagined. Her words meant more to me than I could express. The journey from that first hostile encounter to genuine family relationship had been one of the unexpected gifts of this entire experience. The anniversary celebration was held on a perfect October evening, with the California hills painted gold by the setting sun. Our original students returned as honored guests, many now successful professionals who credited their time at our school with changing their life trajectories. But the most moving moment came when Dr. Elena Rodriguez, now 78 and officially retired, but still actively involved in our educational design, presented me with a surprise gift. It was a leather-bound book containing letters from hundreds of our graduates, describing how their education had impacted not just their careers, but their families and communities. "Dear Ms. Martinez," read one letter from a graduate now working as an environmental engineer, "I wanted you to know that my younger brother just started his freshman year at UC Berkeley, studying environmental science. He says he wants to be like his big sister. Our whole family's trajectory changed because you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Another letter, from a graduate who had started an urban farming cooperative, wrote, "The technical skills I learned at your school were important, but what really changed my life was learning that I could be a problem solver, that my background and experiences were assets, not obstacles. I'm now teaching my own children that they can create solutions to problems they care about." As I read these letters aloud to the gathered crowd, I thought about the ripple effects of education, how changing one life could impact generations. It was exactly what Harold had envisioned when he wrote about building something that would echo for generations. But perhaps the most significant moment of the evening came when Maria Santos, now 27, and the successful founder of 3 community-based schools, approached the podium to speak. 5 years ago, I was a high school student who thought college wasn't for people like me, she began. I thought I had to choose between education and family, between my dreams and my responsibilities. Sarah Martinez and this school showed me that was a false choice. She paused, looking out at the audience of students, graduates, faculty, and community members. But what I learned here wasn't just about engineering or project management or sustainable technology. I learned that I could be a creator, not just a consumer. I learned that my community's challenges were opportunities for innovation. I learned that education works best when it serves real people solving real problems. Maria's speech concluded with an announcement that took even me by surprise. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Community College Network, a nonprofit organization that will help communities across the country start their own versions of what we've built here. We already have commitments from 5 cities, and we're just getting started. The audience erupted in applause, but I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride, certainly, but also a profound sense of completion. The school had succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, but more importantly, it had inspired others to create their own solutions, their own institutions, their own paths to change. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, I found myself alone on the campus, walking the paths I'd walked hundreds of times before. The buildings were quiet now, but I could almost hear the echoes of thousands of conversations, debates, discoveries, and breakthroughs that had happened here. I stopped at the library, where Harold's letter was still displayed, now alongside dozens of other documents chronicling our school's growth and impact. But tonight, I was drawn to a newer addition, a letter from my mother that I'd discovered among her papers after her death, written shortly before she passed away. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. But I wanted you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. You have your father's intelligence and determination, but you have something more important. You have your own moral compass, your own sense of what matters." The letter continued, "I know you've sometimes wondered about your father, about why he never reached out to you. I've always told you that some people live in different worlds, but I want you to understand something. The world you've created for yourself, the life you've built through your own choices and efforts, is far more valuable than any world you might have inherited." Reading those words again, 5 years after first discovering them, I was struck by how prophetic they had been. I had inherited Harold's resources, but I had used them to build something entirely my own, something that reflected my values and experiences rather than his. The final paragraph of my mother's letter had become something of a personal mission statement. Never forget that your worth doesn't come from what you have or where you came from, but from what you do with whatever life gives you. Make your choices count, Mija. Build something that matters. As I walked back to my house, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 5 years ago, I had been a high school teacher struggling to make ends meet, passionate about education, but limited in my ability to create systemic change. The inheritance from Harold had provided resources, but more importantly, it had provided a challenge to think bigger, to be bolder, to believe that real change was possible. The laughter that had greeted my arrival at the Whitmore estate had long since been replaced by something far more meaningful: the sound of young people discovering their potential, the conversations of innovative educators, the energy of communities working together to solve problems. But perhaps the most important lesson I'd learned was that true inheritance isn't about money or property or even opportunities. It's about the courage to use whatever resources you have, whether they're financial, intellectual, or simply the accumulated wisdom of your experiences, to create something that serves others. The Community College of Real Solutions would continue to grow and evolve, but it would always be grounded in the belief that education works best when it connects to real problems, real communities, and real opportunities for students to discover their own power to create change. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about Harold's letter one more time, about his challenge to build something real, something that would make my mother proud. Looking out at the campus we'd created, at the lives we'd changed, at the model we'd provided for others to follow, I knew that we'd succeeded beyond even his ambitious vision. We'd built something that was not just real, but alive, growing and inspiring others to build their own versions of a better world. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance of all. Not just the resources to make a difference, but the knowledge that such differences were possible, and the courage to keep building, keep growing, keep believing in the potential of every person who walked through our doors. The foundation we'd built was strong, but it was also flexible, designed to grow and adapt as our understanding of our mission deepened. And as I prepared for sleep, I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new students ready to discover their own power to create positive change in the world. The story that had begun with laughter and skepticism had become something far more powerful, a testament to the possibility of transformation, the importance of authentic education, and the ripple effects that occur when we have the courage to build something real, something that serves others, something that makes the world a little bit better than it was before. And in the quiet of that October evening, surrounded by the peace of the campus we'd created and the satisfaction of work that mattered, I knew that Harold's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the land or even the letter. His greatest gift had been the challenge to discover my own capacity for creating change, for building something that would outlast any individual life and continue to serve others long after I was gone. The Community College of Real Solutions was no longer just Sarah Martinez's school or Harold Whitmore's legacy. It belonged to every student who had walked through our doors, every faculty member who had contributed their expertise, every community member who had supported our mission. It belonged to everyone who believed that education could be transformative, that young people deserved opportunities to discover their potential, and that real change was possible when people worked together toward common goals. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear the distant sound of the fountain that still played in the courtyard, the same fountain that had been installed in memory of Harold's grandfather, the Irish immigrant who had come to California with nothing but hope and determination. It was a fitting reminder that every generation has the opportunity to build something new, something better, something that serves the future rather than simply preserving the past. The laughter had stopped long ago, but the work continued, and the legacy grew stronger with each passing day.